going live in 30 seconds, and we start at 1 p.m. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, and a very warm welcome to this international meeting on bullying, co-organized by UNESCO and the World Anti-Bullying Forum. My name is Vibeke Jensen, and I'm Director of the Division for Education for Peace and Sustainable Development at UNESCO headquarters here in Paris. And it is my division who has been coordinating UNESCO's activities to support education sector responses to school violence and bullying. As Frida Wag, the Managing Director of the World Anti-Bullying Forum, will explain shortly, this meeting is the first one of a series of 4 virtual meetings on bullying, co-organized by UNESCO and the World Anti-Bullying Forum. And the theme of this first meeting will be the whole education approach to bullying prevention. And Frida will mention later the themes of the 3 other meetings. Before I speak about the importance for UNESCO of responding to school bullying and inclusive cyberbullying, let me say on behalf of UNESCO that we are very, very delighted to have this partnership with the World Anti-Bullying Forum. We also feel privileged to have with us today some of the most renowned researchers in the areas of bullying prevention in the world. And you can see their names, affiliations, and faces on the slide. They'll be introduced in more detail later on before they start speaking. Now, preventing and addressing school bullying, and more broadly all forms of school violence, is at the core of the mandate of UNESCO's education work. Why? Because we have plenty of evidence on the negative consequences of school violence and bullying on the education and health and well-being of children and young people. Those who are targeted by violence, bystanders, perpetrators, and at the end of the day, the whole school community. Because of all these well-documented negative consequences, such as missing classes, school dropout, lower academic performance, school violence in all its forms, including bullying, is a serious infringement of children's and adolescents' right to education. It is an obstacle to their right to learn in safe and inclusive environments, which is a right that all countries have committed to secure by 2030 as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And violence in schools is not a phenomenon that affects only a few children in some countries. Global data on the prevalence of bullying shows that almost 1 in 3 students have been bullied by their peers at school at least once in the last month. This is over 40% in some regions. For many years, UNESCO has made efforts to support its member states in responding to school violence. However, during the last decade, we have intensified our efforts, and I'll give you a few examples of what we've been doing. On this slide, the cover pages of some of the documents on school violence and bullying we have published over the last 10 years, most of them having become reference documents. And UNESCO has paid particular attention to school violence that is based or related to gender. UNESCO was, for instance, the first UN agency to focus on school violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, showing that LGBTIQ learners are very much targeted by bullying. UNESCO's role is to compile and analyze the most comprehensive, up-to-date, and relevant data on school violence and bullying, so that our member states have the evidence they need to make decisions. And that is why we this is exactly what we did when we in 2019 released a report called Behind the Numbers, Ending School Violence and Bullying. Our role is also to document promising and good practices from all over the world to help ministries of education and other stakeholders design evidence-based policies and programs. And based on the good practices we documented, we developed, for instance, the global guidance on addressing sRGBV in collaboration with UN Women. Finally, UNESCO's role is to raise awareness and contribute to the mobilization of governments and other stakeholders to end all forms of school violence. In 2019, UNESCO member states decided to create a new International Day against violence and bullying at school, including cyberbullying, to be celebrated every year. And the theme of the first International Day, which was celebrated last year on the 5th of November, was Together Against Bullying in School. And we celebrated the day by organizing an international conference on bullying in collaboration with the French Ministry of Education, Youth, and also experts. And a number of experts were involved in the preparation of the conference, and which was led by a scientific committee who developed a short document titled Recommendations on Preventing and Addressing School Bullying and Cyberbullying. And today's meeting is precisely building on these recommendations and on the conference in a continuum of efforts to keep the momentum until the next World Anti-Bullying Forum. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Frida Wag, who will introduce the World Anti-Bullying Forum and will present the rationale for these meetings that we are organizing together and their objectives. It will then be my colleague, Christoph Kornu, from the section of Health and Education in my division, who will moderate the meeting. Thank you all for being with us here today, and I hope we'll have a fruitful and interesting conversation over the next 1.5 hours. Thank you, and over to you, Frida.
Thank you, Vibeke. My name is Frida Wag, and I am the Managing Director of the World Anti-Bullying Forum. And I'm happy to welcome all of you from around the world to this first virtual meeting on bullying that we are organizing together with UNESCO. So thank you to UNESCO and also to all the speakers that are joining us today who will speak on this important matter. Next slide, please. Thank you. The World Anti-Bullying Forum was initiated by the Swedish NGO Friends, which is where I am working. And the World Anti-Bullying Forum is a huge global conference that we do every 2 years. It is a place where we gather practitioners and policymakers and researchers from various research fields to meet and really have a forum about bullying and how to prevent it. We saw a need to bridge the gap between these different areas, and we want to facilitate a dialogue on bullying between these different stakeholders. Because if we don't talk about this from our different point of views, we will have no real chance of actually stopping and preventing bullying for children around the world. And the objectives of the World Anti-Bullying Forum is to stop bullying and other forms of violence in accordance with the Convention of the Rights of the Child and the Global Sustainable Goals that are set out by the United Nations, and to really share the best available knowledge on how bullying can be prevented. Researchers that have academic knowledge and policymakers that control and decide about children's living conditions, and the practitioners that work with children and for children together with young people, we must meet and come forward together in these areas. And we want to gather and coordinate and make this knowledge easily accessible globally and digitally. And we hope that you all can join us in November in Stockholm, where we will organize the 3rd World Anti-Bullying Forum. Either in person, you are mostly welcome to Stockholm, but also there is possibility to join through a conference platform, of course. And we are delighted that UNESCO, together with us, are organizing these 4 international meetings this year, and they are very important stepping stones to the 3rd World Anti-Bullying Forum. So today we will discuss and listen and dig deeper into the theme of the whole education approach. The next meeting in May will be about the definition of school bullying. A lot have happened around the definition in the recent years, and we will all have an opportunity to investigate that further. The third meeting in July will be about bullying that involves children with disabilities. And the fourth one in September will look at the role of teachers in preventing and addressing bullying and cyberbullying. And these meetings are, as I said, important stepping stones to the World Anti-Bullying Forum in November, because all of your questions and discussions and your what you will be talking together with us today about will trigger discussions that could be continued in November at the World Anti-Bullying Forum. And they will also be important input and food for thought for us organizing the forum, so we can know more on how we should approach these themes to deepen the conversations and take further steps in advancing science. So again, I'm happy to welcome you all to this meeting today, and I'm looking forward to listening to you and your contributions, the speakers, but also those of you who are attending from around the world. Thank you. And I will hand back to, over to Christophe from UNESCO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frida. So I should now be visible on the screen. And so I'm Christophe Cornu, working at UNESCO in the section of health and education, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this meeting. If I can ask my colleague to let me show up on the screen, please. So I'm going to give you, first of all, a few explanations about the structure of the meeting, and then I will also explain how we will communicate using the Zoom platform. So there will be two main presentations during this meeting. Each one of them will involve several speakers. After each presentation, we'll ask you a couple of questions, and the speakers will comment the survey findings live. And after the surveys, we'll dedicate time to answer your questions and address your comments. So in terms of communications, you can ask questions and make comments whenever you want during the presentations or after the presentations, but you can do that only by using the Q&A function. That's at the bottom left of your Zoom screen. Please do not try to use the chat function or the raise hand function to ask questions, because these functions are not available today. So you will receive messages, and you have started to receive messages from the organizers via the chat function, but you will not be able to interact via the chat yourself. Some of your questions will be answered directly by the Q&A moderators using the Q&A stream, and otherwise my colleagues will share with me a selection of your questions and comments. I will put them to the speakers, and the speakers will answer these questions and address these comments directly during the Q&A sessions. One last point in terms of communications regarding languages and interpretation. As you will have seen in the chat function, this meeting is, there's interpretation available for this meeting in English and French. So if you haven't seen yet, if you are a bit lost, or if you're not used to Zoom, there's a button on the bottom right of your Zoom screen called interpretation, which is where you can choose the language. Je vais le dire en français maintenant pour ceux qui sont français.
I'm going to reiterate this in French if you haven't understood. If you haven't selected the language yet, there is interpretation into English and into French for this meeting. So if you go to the bottom right of your screen, there is an icon, interpretation icon with a globe, and you can choose French or English, as the case may be.
On the whole education approach to bullying prevention. This presentation will provide us with some background on how this framework was developed to conceptualize the response to bullying. Speakers will define the whole education approach, explain what its characteristics are. You will also see a brief overview of the components that will be explained during the second presentation. The speakers will explain how this approach and the terminology stand vis-a-vis other approaches that have been used so far. And finally, they will point out some gaps in terms of implementation of this approach at country level, and also in terms of research and evidence. So we'll have three speakers. The first speaker is Professor James O'Higgins-Norman from Ireland. James is the director of the National Anti-Bullying Research and Resource Center at Dublin City University. James also holds the UNESCO chair on tackling bullying in schools and the cyberspace. This chair was created 2 years ago. He's the co-founding editor-in-chief of the International Journal on Bullying Prevention, and he was the chair of the World Anti-Bullying Forum, the second World Anti-Bullying Forum that took place in Dublin in 2019. So you can tell that James knows a lot about bullying and cyberbullying. Our second speaker is Laurent Braho. Laurent Braho works in the French Ministry of Education, Youth and Sports, and is in the team who designs the national anti-bullying policy and also supports the implementation of this policy at country level. Laurent was very involved in the development of the recommendations that were mentioned earlier on by Vibeke. And finally, we have another very renowned expert researcher in the area of bullying prevention. It's Professor Donna Cross from Australia. She teaches in the University of Western Australia. And Professor Donna Cross is very, as I said, very renowned researcher. She currently leads 6 research projects addressing bullying and cyberbullying prevention. And her work has really contributed to major changes in child and adolescent health policies and practice in Australia. So now I will hand over to James. James, the floor is yours for the first presentation.
Thank you, Christoph, and it's very nice to be with everyone today and everyone who's joining us from around the world as we prepare for the World Anti-Bullying Forum in November. So I ask my colleagues now if they would like to put the slide up that I'll speak to. That would be very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. So in 2020, as was mentioned by previous speakers, the UNESCO General Assembly established the International Day Against School Violence and Bullying, including cyberbullying. And it was decided that there would be an international conference held on the 5th of November last year to mark that first International Day Against Bullying. The conference was hosted by the government of France, and a scientific committee was established to prepare for the conference. The scientific committee was composed of experts from France and international experts from Europe, South America, Asia and Australia, as well as our colleagues in UNESCO. The scientific committee immediately set about a wide-ranging consultation with over 50 experts from across the globe to ascertain from them what they understood to be the levers of success in establishing programs designed to tackle bullying in schools and also cyberbullying. We also asked them to advise us on good practices that were supported by research and promising practices that had not yet been through peer review or maybe have not been scaled up to a national level. The consultation was extremely useful in helping the scientific committee to develop recommendations for what we now call the whole education approach to tackling school violence and bullying, including cyberbullying. Central to the development of the whole education approach was an acknowledgement that current definitions of bullying do not always help to describe the full context of the phenomenon of bullying, and that the existing whole school approach may not be adequate for tackling bullying as it occurs across societies. Next slide, please. So just to say a little bit more about that. There was strong agreement across the experts we consulted with that the dominant definition of bullying, known as the Alveus definition, while useful for measuring and describing a psychological, maybe, understanding of bullying behavior, it also failed to capture the fullness of the experience of bullying behavior, including the sociological, educational, and technological dimensions. So we found that there was a need to broaden the conversation beyond the walls of schools and to focus on the holistic and comprehensive responses to bullying that were being initiated around the globe. The whole education approach recognizes the importance of the interconnectedness of the school with the wider community and indeed wider society. If we can understand bullying within this wider context, then we can move towards a learner-centered approach that deals not just with the child who bullies and their target, but also their families, their relationships, their community, their place in society, and many structural issues such as racism and homophobia. So everyone agrees that the school is a key, that schools are key to tackling bullying, but the whole education approach recognizes that the entire education sector and indeed society has a role to play in the response to school bullying. Next slide, please. So on this slide here, you can see there are 9 components of what we are now calling the whole education approach. They refer to elements operating at different and simultaneous levels to reduce bullying and cyberbullying. They have been identified as the core components that should be combined as part of a comprehensive or holistic response to bullying and cyberbullying, and in order to be truly effective. And they reflect an understanding of bullying that is located within a wider ecosystem than just the local school. So I'd like to hand over now to my colleague, Professor Donna Cross, who will say a little bit more about this.
Next slide, please. When we look at a whole of education approach, obviously we are very conscious of the interconnectedness of all of the activities that we have related to a health promoting school environment and a health promoting community. When you look at each of these components that are shown here, children and young people being essentially involved, that schools are supported by education authorities, that there are opportunities for practicing positive and respectful and caring interactions, that the resources that are available to schools are being implemented effectively across schools, that there are not just one-off measures that are being used, that there are multiple ways that we're assessing the effectiveness. Each of these components together work to interact, to lead to outcomes that we expect to see as a result of quality implementation. Next slide, please. So in many countries, we have different ways that we describe the approach that we use to address bullying. And in your own countries, no doubt there is a phrase that you use regularly. You will have heard so far that we're testing the term a whole education approach to see if this is something that would have meaning to multiple countries, but recognise that that might not necessarily be the case. Many people have used the term whole school approach. And one of the challenges with a term like that is that it puts all the responsibility on a school and often on the local school, rather than recognising the contribution that education broadly makes. But when you look at some of the names that are commonly used, that are listed here on this slide, you'll see that perhaps other approaches also, or other names also capture the community component of the community contribution that we might see in our efforts to try and reduce bullying. Many of you would be aware that socio-ecological approach, that is often the basis of the work that's been done to date to test the impact of a comprehensive approach to education. That's bigger than the classroom. Obviously, approaches to learners and to teaching environments and curriculum is necessary, but not sufficient. Everybody clearly recognises that there are many other influences on bullying behaviour. the environments that children are in, the values that are expressed, the approaches and norms within a wider community, and that all of these actions need to be considered very carefully when we are thinking about how we describe the approach that we're taking. In particular, if we were just to use terminologies like a whole school approach, it may be that schools and those who are working to support schools would consider maybe only focusing on things like classroom curriculum. So we know that it's very important that we consider other terminologies and whatever suits the language that you're working in, and obviously the community is key. But we want to ensure, as part of using terminology like the whole education approach, that we address both the multi-component and multi-stakeholder components of that overall approach. In Australia, for example, we have been using terms like a safe schools approach. Some of that language is perhaps describing some of the process. And of course, this is similar in other countries where perhaps the focus has been taken off bullying prevention per se and a keener focus on well-being or social emotional learning. Next slide, please. As we start to think about this whole education approach and language that adequately encourages people to think beyond classroom, think beyond individual schools, we then need to look at the research that's supporting our understanding of the actions that we should be taking in this area. And there are many gaps in the research, and on this slide you'll see three of a number that we think are critical to enabling us to have enough evidence to be able to respond and implement bullying prevention programs using a whole education approach. And one of those challenges is that often when we're assessing the effectiveness of a bullying prevention program, we tend to focus on the individual behaviour and less on the impact of the system or the environments that are around the children we're engaging in. More recently, there's been emphasis on the impact of the built environment, for example, and how that might influence behaviour, and the combination of those components that are found to be most effective in school environments. We need to be very conscious of the dose, how much of this intervention that we have in place, in addition to those components, are necessary to lead to the changes that we hope to see in both behaviour and overall norms in the school environment. We also need to reflect on, is there such a thing as best practice, or do we need to be focusing on promising practices? Do we need to look at the things that appear to be effective in different school environments, recognising that context makes an enormous difference and that schools are not all operating at the same time, starting at the same starting point. So we need to be very aware of the environments that they're in. Which leads me to the next slide. May I have that, please? Which is the challenges that we have related to implementation. So whilst we might have a whole education approach, how do schools and how do we support schools to be able to implement at a whole education level? Schools are much better at implementing classroom-based interventions. That's what they're often well practiced at doing. But we also need to build readiness for broader implementation of policies and practices, ways to engage families, ways to integrate community services within the school environment. And currently there's very little evidence that gives us an understanding of how that should be conducted. How do we build readiness in a school to be able to implement those particular outcomes? We don't often have well-trained staff who have experience in ways to effectively implement policy and broader whole of education practices within the school environment. We also are often limited in our understanding of the sustainability of the strategies that we're putting in place. How do we enable them to be institutionalized so that they continue to be implemented and maintained over time? We need to build staff capacity. In a study that we had in Australia, where we were very interested in enhancing the ways that schools approach cyberbullying in the context of a whole education approach, whilst we provided all the resources and support, without staff feeling like they had enough skills and self-efficacy to implement, we found that the failure of the program elements were due to teachers not having enough confidence to implement it. So we need to ensure that training is provided and that we have enough evidence about what's the most important training to support schools. We also need to support systems in the way that they are providing support to schools and understand what evidence systems need to provide that whole education approach. Schools also often need to understand in evidence that's available to them what their strengths and needs are. If a school's going to implement a whole education approach, they need to know their current status, what's working and what's not working and what's missing, so that they can select from the activities that they don't already have in place to meet this overall approach based on those 9 elements that James mentioned a moment ago. Also, there's last 2, I promise, there's a need for us to be focused on the gaps that we have related to a keen focus, perhaps only on bullying as an outcome, and the need for a whole education approach to look at wellbeing, risk and protective factors, and clearly understanding the best way to deliver those protective factors. And last but not least, we need to be understanding and have better evidence around the ways to plan for that evidence to be available for schools so that they can put it in place. I'll now hand over to Christophe. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Donna. So we have, we were going to go back to the characteristics because I just received a question, and Laurent is going to give some insights on these characteristics also in relation to what is done in France. So I would be very grateful if we could go back to the slide that presents the key characteristics of the whole education approach. Going back again, please. And now we go, so this one, please. And Laurent, so now I'm going to switch from English to French and to speak to Laurent. Laurent, donc vous allez présenter maintenant.
You are going to describe to us the key characteristics, giving us some examples of what the Ministry of Education in France has been doing, how it has implemented this whole education approach. Thank you very kindly, Christophe. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, as you can see here, there are some key characteristics. We have different names for this in France. We also have the school climate approach. The important thing to bear in mind is that it's not a shopping list. It's not a menu where you can pick and choose at will. The effectiveness of this system is only can only be leveraged if you act on all of these components. You have to take a systemic approach, as we say. We've taken some measurements to see how well our campaigns had succeeded, and it emerged clearly that we were only successful when we acted on all of these components. I will give you an example which was presented at the last international conference of last November. It's the French turnkey program that we have been experimenting with for the last 2 years, and that will be taken into all of the schools next year. And this program is fully rooted in this approach. I'll give you a few examples of this program. The keystone, as Donna said, is that you must have a resource team which has been trained in these techniques, which means there's got to be a support protocol. And there's got to be a tremendous amount of training of the pupils themselves. We have to educate the student body. School directors are also trained, principals are trained, particularly in the area of cyberbullying, which has its own very specific characteristics. Now, there are other approaches that are fed into this holistic approach. We have an educational approach where we try to develop empathy in our pupils. And we take this program into the classrooms right from preschool. The idea is to take a blanket approach to the school, and we have a safer internet day. We observe the International Day of Anti-Bullying, and we train pupil or student ambassadors. And we try to involve the entire student body by motivating the students to join the fight against bullying. Now, it's important to remember that the authorities have got to be supportive. They must provide resources, which is why we call this a turnkey program. And we've got to be able to scale up the program. You cannot limit these efforts to certain territories. This approach must be rolled out across the country, throughout the country. And another critical requirement is the participation of children and youth. We have got to put the pupils in the driver's seat, both the targets and the perpetrators. As I said, we try to develop empathy, feelings of empathy in among the children, in the children's minds. We want to make our children alert to the risk of bullying. So that was my attempt to sketch out the approach to this program in France. Thank you very kindly.
So we had this first presentation on the key characteristics of the whole education approach. So now we're going to ask you a couple of questions, and then there will be time for the speakers to answer your questions and address your comments. I can see that there are already a few questions coming. So we're going to ask you, and thank you very much, obviously, James, Donna, Laurent, you will be, I will call you now after we ask the questions to make comments and then to answer the questions asked by the participants. So we're going to have a look now at the first question we would like to ask you. So, and for this question, you will be able to answer using the survey function on your screen. So as you can see on the screen, the question is, what terminology do you currently use most often when you refer to a comprehensive response to prevent and address school bullying? So you can choose one and only one of the 5 options. And as you can see, the results show up on the screen in terms of percentages. So we have definitely a lot of responses saying that you're using the terminology all school approach. So far, 65%. Then comes the all school, all community, all child approach. And then the third most used terminology is all community approach. So we are standing at 60% for all school approach. And then all school, all community, all child approach, 12%. Okay, so now, thank you. We're going to ask you a second question, but this time we're going to use a different tool that maybe some of you are already familiar with. It's the Mentimeter. So if you're not familiar with the Mentimeter, please listen carefully to the instructions I'm going to give. So can we just get rid of this screen that will look again later on? Okay, so the question now is, if you use a different terminology, which one is it? So you can use a computer, a tablet, a mobile phone, or any digital device. You use a search engine and look for the website, which is called www.menti.com. And then you have to enter the following code that you can see on the screen: 17453200. So use any digital device you have. Look for the website in your search engine called www.menti.com, and then use the code that shows up on the screen, 17453200, and then please answer this question, and we're going to see showing up on the screen word cloud showing which terms you are using. So obviously you can answer in French or in English. Don't hesitate to use French if you are a French speaker. So we'll give you a bit more time to answer this question. If you use a different terminology, which one is it? So we can see that you are using systemic approach, ecological approach, school-wide approach, in French, we can see approche systémique, approche globale. So we'll give you, we have currently 36 people who have answered, so you can take a bit more time if you have haven't found yet the website. Another minute just to get this. So now we have 44 responses. So we'll stop in 20 seconds. So I'll ask my colleagues who are managing this to stop now. Okay, so that would be interesting now to have a look at these results. So I would request my colleagues to show the results of the first of the Zoom survey, which was about what terminology you are using, and you had 5 options. So what I noted is that all school approach was coming first. So I don't know if we can see again the results of the first question. We had more or less 60% for all school approach, and we had I think 10 and 10%. So I don't know Can someone tell me if we can see the results on the slide or
I'm
not?
currently sharing the results. I hope that you can all see them.
No, I can't see anything. So if we can't see this one, okay. So now we can see, that the old school approach is the most used terminology. And then the second terminology that is used by most people is the old school, all community, all child approach. And then all education approach is used by a few people, 10, and all community approach. So I don't know if James, Donna, Laurent, you have any comments on this? You can step in whenever you want.
Christophe, I think it's often a challenge, isn't it, that we pick up the language that we have seen most commonly used. And I think that some years ago, it was quite innovative to think about a whole school approach to addressing bullying versus maybe what has historically been a classroom curriculum or more learner-orientated delivery of content. And I guess that term has stuck and continues to be used. What I really have enjoyed as part of this group that UNESCO is leading is pushing my thinking around to recognise that perhaps that terminology is not capturing a true socio-ecological approach, which we now know is really critical to get sustained change in behaviour in a school environment.
Yeah, thank you very much, Donna. James, would you like to add something to this in terms of this move? I mean, we discussed this in terms of these terminologies are not competing, but definitely the reason why the scientific committee decided to use all education approach had like a rationale that you presented. So I don't know, James, if you would like to add something to what Donna said in terms of the fact that, yes, all school approach has been used and is still used by a lot of people. And nobody here is saying that it's wrong, but definitely all education approach is something that we are proposing as an alternative terminology. So James, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you, Christophe. And just adding to what Donna said there, that the language of whole school approach is pervasive now across the education systems across the world, but there isn't uniformity in terms of what people understand the whole school approach to be. And also, I think the way that we measure and the way that we the instruments we use for measuring the whole school approach or for measuring initiatives need to evolve as well, because if we are talking about a socio-ecological approach to bullying prevention, and we're looking at the whole of society and the whole of the education system and all the stakeholders that are involved, then simply going in with an Aldea's bullying questionnaire to measure bullying prevalence in a school is not sufficient for that task. So we need to broaden it out in terms of who is responsible, and that responsibility is wider than the local school. We're very much aware now in terms of a global world and the connectedness of the internet and the way that people's lives have evolved in the last 20 years, that the school is so deeply and intimately connected to a lot of different ecosystems. And so we need to elevate our understanding of the whole school approach to a whole education or a whole society ecosystem. That if we're really to deal with what the complexities of modern day bullying and cyberbullying are.
Thank you very much, James. Could we have also a look at the word cloud that is based on the second question, because it was very interesting to see. Okay, so here we see something very similar. We see that we have school-wide approach like very close to school-wide approach with this very the focus on the school. And then we have a holistic approach, ecological approach, systemic approach in English. And then when we look at the French, the terminology that comes most often is approche systémique, which is actually a translation of a systemic approach. And then we have approche globale. So I don't know if you have further comments on this. I mean, they just, I think, confirm what you just said, that there was the focus on school, definitely on the school level. And now there's this request or proposition to perhaps shift not just from the school level, but also to a broader level, which involves the whole education sector and also beyond the education sector. Any additional comments from you, James, on this?
I think if you look at the first of the 9 core characteristics that we say are part of the whole education approach, it emphasizes the importance of political leadership and national policy. And a lot of the national policies still use the term whole school approach and are focused on enabling the local school to tackle bullying problems within the walls of the school. So I think there's an important, all of the 9 characteristics are equally important, but if we were to start with one of them, I think we would need to start with the whole, the political leadership and policy development, so that there's a recognition that schools are part of a wider ecosystem, and that a whole education or a whole society or a wider systemic approach is needed to tackle bullying. Because the bullying that happens in one school and affects one child's life is so deeply connected to a whole myriad of layers of different realities in that school and outside that school. So, but I think national policy is really important in terms of moving us from a whole school to a whole education approach.
Thank you. So now, I mean, I will I will read some of the questions that came during the presentation, and I will ask either Donna, James, or Laurent, or even speakers who will come later to answer these questions. So there's one question saying, is there a place for interdisciplinary work for bullying prevention in the whole education approach? Who wants to take this question? Is there a place for interdisciplinary work for bullying prevention in the whole education approach?
I'm cautious of responding that I understand what the person who posed the question means by interdisciplinary. In Australia, we would see that as a cross-curricular, where it's addressed in a variety of learning areas. So I hope I'm on the right track for the nature of the question. I just want to check, Christophe, is that your understanding of discipline across cultures? Just checking that maybe the person who wrote the question is going to have more.
My understanding of the question that comes from Christos Chalitou, I think it's like working between different professionals. That's what I understand, between educators, health professionals within the school, between school principals, teachers, students, etc. And that's something we're going to touch on in the second presentation. That's what I understand by interdisciplinary work, but perhaps I misunderstood this question.
I think that perhaps one of the challenges of using a term like whole education approach is that health has a really important contribution and benefit from approaches to reduce bullying. And so when we think interdisciplinary in the ways that you've just suggested might be implied here, Christophe, the need to involve community services, the need to involve health, the departments of health, the need to involve justice, those organizations each seeing that they have a role to play, and that perhaps education alone, I know we're starting to look very big, But when we look at the implications of bullying and the level that it disrupts a child's development and life opportunity, it certainly would engage a number of other disciplines. I'm not aware of good quality research that has been done in this area where we are understanding more fully this outcome, but I am aware that the World Health Organization has certainly seen it as priority and set it out as a target for their efforts as well. So perhaps we need to be more inclusive in using the term education.
Yes, and I see that the person who asked the question, Christo Charitou, confirmed that here we're talking about different professionals working in a collaborative way, and it's something we're going actually to touch on during the
C'est très important, Christophe, effectivement, que dans la mesure où...
Yes, Christophe, it's very important since we are here outside the normal of violence occurrences which could be dealt with by the head of a school. Here, the sanction would strengthen the bullying if we don't work with the group. So we need these non-blaming methods and the various professions which can be disconnected from a traditional type of sanction. So we need social workers, teachers, doctors, nurses, etc. So it's shared collective work, moving away from the traditional separation between education and the rest. So we need to bring this all together.
Thank you very much, Laurent. We will go back to this in the second presentation. There's a question about, can we see again the 9 components? And we're going to see them in detail in a couple of minutes. There's another question here that I think we will also address very briefly. It's about, I here focus on training empathy among the student. Is there also a focus on safety in the community? So please, the speakers who are going to speak now for the second presentation, please keep this question in mind, because I think that what you're going to say about some of the components will respond to this question. There's also a question on that I just saw now. So there's a question for you, Laurent, that I think we can, that's kind of more bilateral. We can do that a bit later. And I see another question on, yes, so there's one comment saying, I wholeheartedly agree with the whole education approach. I find that schools and school districts here resist spending time, energy, and resources to tackle the problem. They seek a quick fix and believe that they must emphasize academic skills. How do we persuade educational authorities of the critical importance of these efforts? How do we persuade educational authorities of the critical importance of these efforts? Meaning all the efforts that schools have to do, but even beyond the schools. So who wants to take this question?
Well, I think I would just say that it's, and that's thanks to Sherry Bowman for that question. I think at the heart of the whole education approach is this idea of partnership. So conversation has to start between everybody who's involved in and concerned about bullying. So the idea that schools are left on their own and encouraged to find fixes at a local level. We need to gather more evidence to show that has a limited effect, limited outcomes in terms of preventing bullying. You know, by the time people are looking for quick fixes, we're already too far down the road in that we're intervening and trying to address a bullying situation. So a more systemic approach involves partnership. It means conversation. So if that conversation isn't starting at a national level or with policymakers and so on, then schools need to initiate that conversation and bring the other partners down this journey, to discover that a whole education approach is necessary and that all stakeholders have a role. I think that persuasion that Sherry's asking about has to be initiated, if not by the policymakers, then by the schools themselves, in talking to each other, dissolving the boundaries between the schools, connecting with other schools in their district, in their area, and involving all other stakeholders.
Thank you, James. So I see also questions about the participation of students. We'll discuss that now. I see also a question about the involvement of parents. We're going to discuss this in the second presentation. So I see that our Christian Berger will speak later, would like to say something. Is that to answer one of the questions that were asked?
I'm sorry, I'm skipping it, and just was a mistake.
Sorry?
Just go ahead. What was a mistake?
Okay. So because the two questions I just mentioned about participation of students and parents are going to be covered in the second presentation, we're going to move now to the second presentation. So during this presentation on the 9 components of the whole education approach, there will be the speakers you have already listened to, James, Laurent, and Donna, and we'll have 2 additional speakers now. So there's Professor Christian Berger from Chile. Christian is an associate professor in education psychology in the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and is the author of several studies focusing on the effects of peer norms on aggression and bullying. And then we'll have Dr. Shoko Yoneyama. Professor Yoneyama is originally from Japan, and she's currently a senior lecturer in Asian studies in the University of Adelaide in Australia. She has worked extensively in the sociology of education and obviously on bullying, and she's recognized internationally as the author of the book titled The Japanese High School, Silence and Resistance. So now it's over to you, Christian, to start the second presentation.
Thanks, Christoph, and good morning to everyone, at least morning here in Chile. Thanks for attending this webinar, and I really look forward to see you and meet you all in Stockholm for the World Anti-Bullying Forum in November. I will now focus on a couple of specific components of the whole education approach. So in line with the ecological perspective that we were discussing, the evidence shows that any intervention, in order to be successful, needs a context that's aligned with these goals, no? And that provides the appropriate conditions and support. In its wider layer, this implies social and cultural conditions that are represented in a strong political leadership and robust legal and policy frameworks. Leadership needs to be consistent from the national policies and guidelines to specific and proximal school management. This alignment must also consider a legal body in which laws, regulations, and policies must be explicit at the national level and consequently translated into school regulations at the local level. Research also shows that laws and policies need to acknowledge specific aspects related to identity that might underline bullying and discriminations, for instance, race or sexuality. And in this sense, leadership, laws, and policies must be oriented towards inclusion and follow an inclusive education approach. And finally, these laws, and considering that peer relations have shifted to a great extent to online interactions in the last years, and especially during the last year, laws, policies, and guidelines need to be adapted to their particulars of cyberbullying. And this is a new and increasing line of research that we are seeing. Can we move to the next slide, please? The second component is related to one of the questions of the attendees, relates to the idea of a safe psychological school environment. Right? So bullying is possible in contexts where individuals feel unsafe and isolated. The main characteristics and emotional experiences in this context are fear, distrust, and lack of support. In turn, the evidence is clear in showing that contexts enhance a sense of belonging, that are supportive, and that establish interpersonal relationships based on respect and care, decrease the probability of bullying to having an increased nurturing experiences. In this sense, creating an environment where students feel safe is crucial. All school staff needs to be sensitized and appropriately supported in order to create these caring environments. We cannot give responsibility to the child, to the student. We need to create the responsibility in the context, in the school context. Care for others must not only be reinforced by policies and regulations, but also through social modeling. So school leaders, teachers, and staff must be role models for caring relationships for their students, and they need the support and the context for being these role models for them. And finally, in order to foster safe psychological environments, every bullying situation should be recognized and responded to in a timely, consistent, and effective way. This explicitly establishes what is not accepted within this context and generates conditions for students to feel secure, listened to, and protected when facing victimization. So again, the responsibility for creating these environments does not lie in the students, but on the context, and therefore the whole education approach, the whole school approach and education approach is kind of the focus we're following. I will now hand it to Professor Yoneyama. So Shogo, all yours.
Thank you, Christian. 皆さん、こんにちは. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here, and thank you for attending this seminar. So, in the whole education approach, we often talk about care, and care or caring is positioned as a keyword that is opposite to bullying. So, the third component of the whole education approach is training and support of teachers. And in order to foster a caring school environment, it is very important for teachers to be supported. This needs to be done through training, mentoring, and accessing resources such as learning and teaching materials that are useful to foster a caring and learner-centered school environment. Teacher training should exist at both pre-service and in-service stages. First, training should increase teachers' familiarity with bullying prevention, enabling them to establish a caring and learner-centered classroom and social environment. Teachers' training should also include practical knowledge for intervention about how to recognize bullying and how to deal with it, with reference to existing policy frameworks and guidelines. This could, for instance, include role plays of specific cases, plus information about who to talk to first within the school, what questions to ask to whom, and how to communicate with guardians. A clearly established support system for teachers who have noticed bullying is essential so that they don't feel isolated. So for instance, a mentoring system clearly laid out responsibilities of school leadership, the presence of an on-site specialist in school whose role is to handle bullying. Easy access to a school counselor and social worker is also important. But teacher support should also be considered within the broader context of teachers' work conditions to enable them to maintain caring relationships with learners. Teachers may find it difficult to be as caring as they want to be because of the excessive amount of work they are expected to do. So in Japan, for instance, there is an excellent bullying prevention law, but it hasn't been very effective because most teachers are simply too busy to notice or handle bullying. Their working hours are 40% longer than the international average, so teacher support needs to include measures to reduce their workload. The Japanese example shows that in the whole education approach, teacher training and support must be looked at in the broader context of teachers' work conditions. One way to address the issue might be to have a teacher or two or staff member in each school whose work is dedicated to helping students and teachers deal with bullying. Next slide, please. The fourth component is curriculum, learning and teaching to promote caring school climate. It means that in order to reduce bullying, the core business of school, that is learning and teaching, must be something that creates caring school climate, that promotes the social and emotional well-being of children. And to achieve this, a learner-centered education, curriculum and pedagogy that is geared towards building caring teacher-student relationships is essential. Ideally, if all of these were provided at school, a bullying-specific curriculum and learning and teaching would not be necessary. I now pass it on to Mr. Braho from French Ministry of Education. Thank you very much.
Merci, Yoko.
Thank you very much, Shoko. Indeed, schools should have staff that is dedicated to managing bullying situations. I've already emphasized that earlier. Now, we talked about training earlier. Now, this implies an effort on training budget because bullying referral requires specific approaches and therefore specific training. The channels, mechanisms, and protocols for local reporting should be known by all members of the educational community, but should also be adapted to students' ages. They should also be anonymous and confidential for cyberbullying as well. We also need to go beyond a local framework. And it's key that we should have reporting mechanisms that are broader, known, and accessible by the entire school community, especially concerning cyberbullying. They should be accessible by parents. It's important that learners are not just witnesses and targets, should be able to talk to a trusted person within or outside of the school. Since cyberbullying is on the rise, partnerships should be implemented with platforms and social networks. And this is something we focused on during the international conference to make sure that those social networks are also a way to report cyberbullying. And I'll give a little bit of context through the perspective of the French situation, where this is something I've emphasized earlier. The first support is local school heads, resource teams, and ad hoc protocols. So it's important to have compensation mechanisms such as support helplines. Indeed, in the case of bullying, if there is no identification of local stakeholders who are in charge, well, then people concerned do not feel able to go and complain in cases of cyberbullying, such as sexting. People in charge within the school are told, well, this happened outside of the school. It's not the business of the school. There's a certain amount of denial. They have a limited amount of time to dedicate to such issues, which means that we need to have compensation mechanisms. In France, we have 3 such compensation mechanisms and helplines as a national number, a helpline with specialists who are there to answer those calls. There's a platform known as Stop Bullying, Stop Harcèlement, and there are 335 bullying contact persons who are in charge and who have 8 days to get in touch with the schools and the families to make sure that there is a dialogue and to ensure that those situations are dealt with. There's also a helpline that's dedicated to cyberbullying. It's dedicated to cyberbullying within the framework of the European In Safe in Hope program to support educators and youth in risk prevention, to promote positive usage of the internet, to coordinate reporting platforms. Now, it's very important that this is understood, especially in the case of cyberbullying. The association that manages this helpline can ask for illicit content to be masked to prevent things going viral, especially in the case of revenge porn and sexting, for example. There's a dedicated helpline in each territory that is sent back to the contact persons. As I've just mentioned, it's fundamental that education authorities collaborate efficiently with various stakeholders, especially with social and health services, as well as with law enforcement, justice, and other sectors. The issue of criminalization, especially for cyberbullying, is very important. Should complaints be taken up by the justice system? Now, what's key here is that the various sectors should be able to provide resources and support to reduce cyberbullying, including, and this is a very strong request in France, a very strong demand, especially from the Minister of Education, Jean-Michel Blanquer, during the international conference, and this includes by the organizations that manage social networks. They need to moderate those social networks, and there's an ethical dimension in the choices they make. It's also key that we should continue collaboration between the education sector and universities in order better to understand what's at stake in bullying, how it can be reduced, and this includes producing studies on cyberbullying. There's also collaboration with local NGO, which would be key. Those reporting mechanisms through the French perspective I've just presented. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laurent. I'll pick it up there. I think, Christophe, is that right? As we make our journey through these core qualities of the whole education approach, it's really important that we keep in mind that none of these core qualities, these 9 core qualities, stands out on its own. Each of them feeds into the other, and it's like a helix of a journey where you start with one, it leads to another, you come back again to the previous one. All of these are equally important in terms of achieving a whole education approach. So I want to look at now the involvement of all stakeholders in the school community, including parents. And this is a really important aspect to the whole education approach. You know, all of the stakeholders in a school community should be involved in anti-bullying initiatives. These includes the boards of management, the school principals, the teachers, other school staff, really important staff like the special needs assistants and the students themselves and the parents. And also to think in terms of the borders or the boundaries of the school being porous, and this spills over into the wider community, so that we have, for example, other community leaders involved in sports or drama activities, or you know, involved in different dimensions of community life. All of these people have a role to play in terms of implementing a whole education approach to tackling bullying and cyberbullying. But when it comes to the school staff, it is important to stress that all school staff should be involved in anti-bullying initiatives. We tend to talk about teachers when we mean school staff. It's kind of a generic phrase that we use, but it's more than teachers. Teachers are very important, but so too are special needs assistants and other members of the school staff. It's often the case that teachers are so busy in trying to direct teaching and learning and deliver a set curriculum and work towards terminal exams, that bullying situations can occur close to them and they don't even see them. but another member of staff who maybe has a different role and a different type of time and space available to them, such as the special need assistants or school chaplains or guidance counselors or the janitor or the school secretary, whoever it might be, that these can actually sometimes pick up on a situation in the school that that a teacher might miss. So it's really important that all of these members of the school staff see themselves as equal champions of the whole education approach and work together to develop and to implement initiatives to tackle bullying and cyberbullying. And this should also include, as I said, the wider community, but also it should also include the parents, and it should include parents' associations, as well as people within the school. The school has so many threads that links it in so many relationships to so many different stakeholders in other schools, in the school district, and also at a national level. And parents are key. Often we can sometimes have the feeling that schools are run by teachers for teachers, but in fact, schools are primarily for children, and the primary educators, certainly here in Ireland, under our constitution, the primary educator of a child is their parent, and they should always be the first and last port of call when we are looking to tackle, prevent and intervene when it comes to bullying issues. So if I might take the next slide now, please. So now we move on and look a little bit more at something that I feel very strongly about, and it's the empowerment of the learner and their participation. The child or the young person, the adolescent, their involvement in the development and the rollout of a whole education approach is essential. If we look at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the emphasis in there on the right of the child to participate, to have a say in decisions about themselves, and to be informed and to exercise their own agency, it's a key part of what the UN wants to see for children, and to understand children as fully human and not just on their way to becoming adults. They are, of course, on their way to becoming adults, but their humanity is still full and valid, and their agency is still important. And we would feel there isn't enough attention given and recognition given to promoting the agency of the child in education systems generally, but particularly in terms of bullying prevention. We tend to talk about, as adults, what can we do to tackle bullying among children, but really we should be starting with the children themselves and giving them their agency in terms of helping us to understand how they define bullying and how they would tackle it. So bullying is a relational phenomenon. This has been identified by many people already today, and all of you who are working with children and working in schools will know this. And that so this phenomenon, this bullying phenomenon occurs within a network of people. Thus, all learners should be involved in prevention programs instead of focusing only on the perpetrators or the targets. When one child bullies another, it happens within an existing set of relationships, and those relationships are structural and they're emotional, and they're key to understanding why the bullying behavior is happening. So when we look at developing initiatives as part of our whole education approach to bullying, we need to look at empowering people within that wider set of relationships, but also understanding that wider set of relationships and how they impact on the individual who may bully or may be targeted. So, for example, if structurally speaking across society, there are very strong, there's very strong racism or homophobia or sexism. If these are things that are prevalent in society, then they're going to impact on that relationship among the children. And when that one child bullies another child, it's going to be influenced by that wider set of relationships. So one important set of learners in all of this is, of course, the bystanders. And some work has been done on this, particularly by some of our colleagues here today and others. And they play a key role in the dynamics of bullying, and should be involved in prevention programs. So instead of always focusing on the perpetrator and the target, there is this massive group of people in the middle, the silent majority, who can be motivated to create an atmosphere in which bullying behavior is not cool, and that they check each other and pull each other back from the brink of that kind of behavior. So similarly, attention should also be paid to the involvement of learners who belong to minority groups. I've hinted at this already, and especially when we're designing and implementing bullying prevention strategies. If we truly recognize that the whole education approach is something that facilitates a society-wide understanding of bullying and bullying prevention, then we need to look at minority groups in society and how they experience themselves, but then also within the school. So issues like racism, homophobia, sexism, and so on, they need to be built into our bullying prevention programs. And then finally, just to say that the initiatives need to be learner-led, and these learner-led approaches and peer approaches to preventing bullying should be implemented in conjunction with programs involving school staff and other adults. But that we should be handing over power and recognizing agency to children and facilitating them in leading the initiatives to tackle bullying and cyberbullying. I'll pass you on now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. The ninth of the components that we're arguing would form part of a whole of education approach is focusing on evidence and the role that the school should play in monitoring school bullying and obviously evaluating the impact of the sorts of activities that they have going on. In Australia, we have a phrase, sadly, it doesn't have a very good meaning, but often if we measure it, we treasure it. So to lift the status of bullying interventions within schools, often collecting data on the impact and the effectiveness of the work that's going on can often lift the status of the implementation of that program in that environment. I think we need to be considering as part of that, that this component isn't the ninth component. It is one of 9. And the sequence that you see of each of these components isn't suggesting that that's the least effective or the last one that we should be thinking about. In fact, the importance of benchmarking, where children are at whenever a school decides to start commencing data collection on this issue, monitoring how the school's going relative to the activities that they have in place, evaluating the effectiveness of the interventions that they're putting in place, and ideally using those data to inform the way that they roll out the whole of education approach within their school environment. And this means that there needs to be data collected both at a school level and at a system level. It's obviously very helpful for a school to be able to understand how it is performing relative to norms within the country or the state, wherever the system level data is being collected. And also it allows schools to use their benchmarks to see how other schools are responding based on their own data. So if we have schools, for example, who are noticing that the interaction with families is very poor, they could look at other schools that have similar issues or are doing well, so that they can learn ways that they can share the approaches that they have. Many of the data collection techniques that are used in schools and systems are based on surveys and are often quantitative, lots of counting. And certainly that's very helpful, but it's also critical that that schools consider qualitative measures that allow them to have thick or deep data to understand why those behaviours that are being measured or the intervention effects that are being measured are making such a difference. Of course, there's a need for standardised measures. If we want to be able to compare data across schools, then there needs to be a consideration at a country level or within country clusters. In Australia, for example, it would be by a state level for measures that could be used across different school systems. So pushing our countries and our policy leaders to think about standardising measures is incredibly helpful to move forward the efforts that are being put in place to address this. And of course, these informal and formal measures of ways to understand the effectiveness of what's going on in schools, in addition to surveys, could also involve informal measures. In some schools, for example, they may have what we would call a graffiti board that sits at the front of the school that is designed to encourage people to write on the wall things that are working, things that are not working, things that are promising, things that could be improved. which provides regular ongoing advice as to what kinds of actions could be taken. So formal and informal approaches are critical. These assessments need to be regular. As researchers, we know that there are lots of factors that can influence the quality of a measure, the time of the year. In Australia, more children bully in the middle of the year than they do at the start of the year when they're establishing the relationships that they have. So standardizing the time of data collection, obviously looking at the range of items that could be included within that survey to not just focus on bullying, look at social emotional learning outcomes, well-being outcomes that we know are important mechanisms to reduce bullying. And obviously looking at other key protective factors, as well as understanding the risk factors that are going on within the school environment. So measures related to school climate, for example, quality of relationships, connectedness, peer support, empathy, the things that are contributing to a positive whole of education approach. We obviously also need to make sure that we're involving staff and students. And as James discussed a moment ago, the importance of student voice, of deeply understanding how well the school is operating for the students, for the clients that we're supporting. And lastly, in thinking about the data that schools are already collecting, there's some really important information that schools could be using that might not realise how it can inform the work that they're doing. Obviously, attendance and academic achievement can be linked to the bullying data that we're collecting so that we can start to answer questions like, is the reduction in bullying reducing attendance, which is clearly an important educational outcome? Is the reduction of bullying enhancing academic outcomes across the school, and in which year groups? And for whom isn't it working? And what should we be doing to try and support those? In Australia, we have a program.
Donna, sorry, we will need to wrap up the presentation because there are plenty of questions and I'd really like to take time to answer the many questions that are coming.
Of course. I'll just mention last of all,
yes,
schools need help in understanding how to use the data that they collect. And I think that's one area where we need to do much more research. Thanks, Christophe.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Thank you, Shoko. Thank you, Christian, James, Laurent. So we do have lots of questions. So we're not going to organize this second survey because I think it's better for the speakers to answer the many questions that are coming. So there was a question about student participation, the concept of student participation. James, you gave lots of examples, and I think you discussed this. So I don't know if we need to provide more explanations about the students' participation. There was also a question about involvement of parents. We haven't really discussed this. I mean, we mentioned that it was important to involve parents. So I don't know if one or two of you could perhaps give examples about how to involve parents.
Well, I'll just say that this is a really important issue, because, and I think that because of the traditional way that schools have evolved and their structures have evolved, they tend to be built around the professional identity of the teacher. And parents are often, certainly here in Ireland, seen as, although in theory, as I said, in law, they are the primary educators of their children. In reality, they're often seen as visitors to the school, and parents are often anxious and nervous about approaching teachers. And then, in my experience, when teachers are approached about cases of bullying and so on, they often become defensive and anxious themselves. So I think there is a need for us to find mechanisms to develop a greater partnership between parents and schools, and to realize that legal right that parents have as primary educators of their children. But it's difficult when there are professional boundaries and there are physical boundaries. And when we hand children over at the gate of a school to teachers and into their care, we should be looking more continuing to go into the school with them rather than handing them over. So it's a challenge, I think, because of the professional structures that are in education, but it is possible. And I think certainly in primary schools here in Ireland, great positive steps have been taken in that way to see parents as partners in the classroom. but it requires a reconceptualization of a school and what a school is about. And that, is, after all, is what the whole education approach is about. It's about reconceptualizing education in itself, never mind how we approach bullying.
Thank you very much, James. Because of the number of questions, I will request speakers that you try to be brief in your responses so that we can answer more questions. Laurent, so I'm going to switch from English into French. Laurent, tu as levé la main, c'était pour répondre à cette question.
Well, you raised your hand because you wanted to answer this question about involving parents, did you? Yes, I did. I wanted to say that I mentioned that we train ambassadors, anti-bullying ambassadors, but we also have parent ambassadors who are there as scouts. And the idea is to avoid raising hopes and creating disillusionment. It is essential when you train a pupil ambassador or a parent ambassador, you've got to have someone opposite them to support them. Otherwise, situations will be reported and nothing will be done. So there's got to be a systemic approach. These phenomena are all interdependent.
I think you wanted to answer a couple of questions. So please just mention the questions briefly, and you can respond. We have 10 minutes left at least for this session. Shoko, the floor is yours.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Christopher. Sorry, I couldn't hear at the beginning of what you're saying. Which question are you talking about?
Yeah, so can you just mention the question you're going to answer and then try to respond briefly? Yeah.
Yes, all right. Thanks, Soad Yonan. Your question is, how do culturally and socially different contexts influence the meaning and practice of ethical leadership and ethical decision making with regard to violence and bullying of one's own school? So yeah, that's a wonderful question. And my background is Japan, and Japan is such a society where conformist pressure is really very strong, and school is the institution which trains young people to become like that. And school rules and disciplines, they all work to create that. So in that sort of environment, the meaning of bullying can be quite different from what is outside other Japan, and maybe this pattern is similar in other parts of Asia as well. So this is a great question, and one way to respond to that would also be the question raised earlier, which is question on interdisciplinary work. I think the studying on bullying so far been predominantly, well, the psychologist has been very, very strong in this field, but I think there is more room for sociologists and other social scientists to come in, even political scientists, to include political imagination into the bullying studies. So that's one response I can give to this question.
Thank you very much, Shoko. I see two questions that are kind of linked to each other. There's one about whether the bullying prevention policies and training programs should be tailored to the needs of all students, regardless of their differences. And so they mention ethnicity, race, religion, sexual orientation. So definitely, I mean, as I think you heard that, and it's not regardless actually of their differences, really taking into consideration the differences of the students. It's not just like one size fits all, even if you can have like one fantastic anti-bullying program, but definitely you need to take into consideration that children are different. And there's one question, which is also a bit linked to what you just said, Shoko, like what should we do in countries where the politics are promoting values that enable bullying? For example, publicly shaming migrants, homosexuals. What can we do? And it's definitely, we are going to look at gaps. Well, you mentioned gaps in implementation. What is possible to do in countries where basically the bullying can be even encouraged? So who would like to take this question?
I guess that's why, precisely why we are doing this. You know, the strength of World Anti-Bullying Forum and UNESCO is that we cover a large number of, countries and, different cultures. So, what we are trying to do in a way is trying to change school, but also society by using bullying as a leverage. So I think by insisting on the importance of fighting against bullying, we are gradually, hopefully, trying to change those practices in other parts of the world in a different cultural context.
Yes, and there's another question that I think perhaps may be linked to this. The question is about the connection between social and emotional learning and core competencies to support pro-social behavior while reducing bullying. So, I mean, obviously, in some cases, you can't mention bullying targeting LGBT children or migrant children, but is there something you can do through the social and emotional learning and developing these skills and competencies? I don't know who would like to respond to this. We didn't really mention the linkages between social and emotional learning and the prevention of bullying.
I would like to jump in here,
yes,
if I may, Christoph.
Yes.
So I think we all agree that social emotional learning is very important, and developing these competencies is a core challenge, and it goes far beyond bullying prevention. It has to do with promoting citizenship, inclusion, well-being. So we know that it's kind of a basic stage for everything to happen. However, I believe that we're not that clear about the impact of social emotional competencies on bullying. For instance, we don't know if the emergence of prosocial behavior impacts consequently bullying and decreases bullying, or by the other way around, when we are able to lower bullying situations and cases, then prosociality might appear and start to grow between students. So we are not really clear about the mechanisms that are there. We also know that empathy, emotional regulation, knowledge of others are key competencies for preventing bullying. We're aware of that. But the research also shows that by themselves, they might be not sufficient. So again, I will bring up to this psychological perspective. So when we focus specifically on competencies, we might underscore the role and responsibilities of wider ecological levels. So teachers, principals, national leadership, or as the last question about policies or politics that are bullying others because of their policies, right? So in order, my opinion is, in order for prosocial interactions to happen, we need to provide opportunities for they to appear between students. So we need to promote and foster safe context. So students, even with high levels of social emotional competencies, will not display caring behaviors if the context does not provide the appropriate conditions for that. And if regulations are not clearly signalizing what is accepted and what is sanctioned. So we need to set the stage for competencies to actually go to bullying. So fostering prosocial behavior is not the same as tackling bullying, but both should be fostered along and together and consistently.
Thanks a lot, Christian. So there's one question that I saw for UNESCO, which is about the fact that child helplines collect a lot of data on bullying, and whether UNESCO would recommend the involvement of the use of child helplines data for further research and actions. So the response is yes, it's definitely something that we are considering, even if it's something that can be a bit complicated to do at international level, but that's definitely something that we've been discussing. So we'll take a last, respond to another question before we give the floor to Magnus, who will conclude the meeting. Was there another question that the speakers picked and they would like to answer in just 1 minute?
Could
I'll just make a 1-minute comment, I promise, Christo. There was a comment you mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, I can't see it now in the chat, but related to, you know, how do you address bullying when you are in a culture where bullying is promoted perhaps by the political parties of the time or is normative within the wider community? And I think we're always challenged by that. And at a local level, if parents are bullying and children are coming to school, they are learning in the school environment based on the school climate, the school's expectations around behaviour, that in this environment, this is how we treat each other and this is the standard that we put forward. So I think we can't be defeated by the political tone. We still need to make sure that our schools are providing environments where children are learning the ways to relate effectively with each other.
Thank you very much, Donna. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point, important point that is linked to one of the questions we heard. So we didn't ask you all the questions we wanted to ask you. I'm talking to the attendees because we thought that would be better for speakers to actually answer your questions and address your comments. I know that we still have quite a lot of questions in the Q&A that we haven't been able to answer, but we'll try to find a way to follow up. So Magnus Lofsson, who is the chair of the scientific committee of the World Anti-Bullying Forum, is going to conclude. And as we said at the beginning, I mean, as Frida mentioned, this was kind of food for thought for the organizers of the World Anti-Bullying Forum. So perhaps Magnus will tell us what kind of food is being digesting now. And before I hand over to Magnus, I would just say, I would like to say thank you to all the people who were involved in the organization of this meeting. I mean, obviously the speakers, but also the UNESCO team, the interpreters, the technicians. And as we mentioned, I think this will be, this is recorded both in French and in English, and it will be able on the UNESCO YouTube channel, I think tomorrow afternoon. So you can go to the UNESCO website and just check whether the link is available, and then please feel free to share the link with people who haven't been able to watch this conference. So now it's over to you, Magnus, for the concluding remarks. Thank you and bye.
Thank you very, very much. It's been such an honor to listen to this discussion and to the questions and to the presentation. When I first met the whole education approach and got familiar with all these components, I became so incredibly happy and enthusiastic. I think really this is a strong framework for doing real change, and I really agree on that all these components need to be in place in order to make a great difference. When I think about Sweden, who has been a forerunner in the anti-bullying work for a long time, I also think a little bit sadly about the latest year's development, because if we look at the data from the health behavior in school-age children, that is doing something that we are doing across a lot of different countries, so we can compare like what is happening over time and also in our own countries and between countries. And in Sweden, since the 2013-14 measurements of bullying, we see an increase, quite a steady increase of bullying actually, and we now on average like 19.6% of children has been bullied sometimes or more in Sweden during the last month in school. And I think that is comparable for a couple of years ago when we had an average on 12.6, so it's kind of a big difference. So in a way, I just want to invite everybody to come to Sweden and help us. We really need the ideas from the rest of the world and good example and practices and how to change this. And when I think about like what has happened during this time, the last decade in Sweden, that has enabled such an increase in bullying, and one important thing from in the whole education approach is also to ask students and learners what are their experiences. And Sweden and the school authorities has asked learners since the beginning of the 90s, or since the end of the 90s, like what are schools actually doing? And we see during the latest years also a decrease when it comes to what students think that schools actually are doing. They say that school doesn't work as actively as they have been reporting earlier years. So I think those two things are at least one explanation, like schools need to work very actively. And in order to do that, we need to have a very strong environment that also supports schools to do this active work. So really the suggestions and ideas from all of you here and the questions has been crucial to how can we do that in a country as Sweden. I'm also thinking a lot about when we're talking about involving parents and also the communication between teachers and parents. And I think when we look at the Article 19 in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, that is about the right to freedom from violences, where also bullying is part of freedom from violence. The article really stresses, and the committee really stresses, that it is the responsibility of the states, of course, but it's also a responsibility of all caregivers. And when you hear the word caregiver, you start thinking about parents, but actually caregivers are defined as everybody, all the grown-ups who is kind of close and near to children are caregivers. So we are all caregivers of children, and teachers are also caregivers. And I think that fits very well to this kind of caring environment that goes also like a thread in many of the 9 components of the whole education approach. So we need to emphasize the importance of care, the importance of safety, and the importance of careful environments. I also just wanted to say that there is a lot of questions, and great questions from all of the audience that we have talked about today. And I want to encourage all of you to send in an abstract to the World Anti-Bullying Forum, because the forum is co-created by everybody who wants to share and who has an idea or thought. It could be the latest research from a researcher. It could be a great tool that a practitioner has developed. It could be from a policymaker that things like the things that we have been listening, for example, what has been done in France on policy level when it comes to cyberbullying. It's a really important step forward. And how can policies from one country influence or give inspiration to other countries to take that kind of policy or make something similar in their special context? So please go to our webpage and please send us an abstract and contribute with your best ideas and solutions, how we can end bullying, not just in Sweden, but in the whole world. We really need that. We have also been talking about this fantastic cooperation between the UNESCO and the World Anti-Bullying Forum and all the experts and researchers and persons who have been presenting here today, how important this kind of cooperations is for thinking more creatively and to also realize what kind of gaps is there that we really need to fulfill. And I just want to appreciate all the contributions and all the work that people has put behind this whole education approach during the last year. It's been incredible, and I'm so grateful for that. And I'm so grateful to have the chance to be part of this community. So we will continue with these steps against the goal of ending bullying in the whole world together. And I think really those seminars that we had today is a fantastic opportunity to speak and to discuss and to think out loud. And we will continue to do that step by step towards the next World Anti-Bullying Forum. We hope also to be able to co-create something around the Stockholm Declaration. We're working with that and to see if we can improve also the policy level when it comes to the whole education approach, at least in Sweden or the Nordic countries or other countries who wants to be involved. So that's also something that we have taken with us from this way of working that UNESCO has provided together with a scientific committee on the whole education approach. So send in an abstract, please come and help us in Sweden to end bullying, and please also work with the policy level people that in your countries, in your context, to see how can we cooperate to make even more change for children and youth in this very, very important issue. Thanks a lot thanks for listening. Thanks for participating. And we are so very proud and happy to be able to be part of such a global community of ending bullying and other forms of violences against children. Thank you.